Hello, everybody. I am back. It's been a while. Been doing some traveling with the family and just haven't really felt very motivated recently. I know that I've talked to a few other people and seem to be kind of experiencing the same type of thing. And I just haven't really felt motivated to do anything. Um, haven't really felt like I was depressed or anything. Just, didn't really feel like doing any research or making any videos or looking into anything. Just kind of enjoying spending time with my family and traveling and, just living my life. But so I've been reading this book recently. It was a book that I know Michael Wan had mentioned in several of his videos. And it's this book here that I got. It's called A Story Waiting to Pierce You by Peter Kingsley. And it's a short book, but it's probably one of the best books I've read for a while, given the fact that it's one of the few books I've been able to really get deep into and not put it down and stop reading it. So I've been reading this book, and the book is essentially about the Mongolians and ancient Mongolia and the shamanistic tradition that they had, and going back to what the author refers to as Hyperborea. And he talks about some Greek legends that mention this character from Hyperborea called Abaris, who went to ancient Greece, and he always carried around this golden arrow that he had, which was part of the tradition of the shamans from Mongolia. And he would walk all around ancient Greece in a circle, and he would visit all of these old temple sites of Apollo. And the author is saying that this Mongolian shaman had, a connection to Apollo, that he carried the god Apollo with him, and that the arrow was something that carried him and enabled him to walk into different worlds. And his name was Abaris Skywalker. And so the name Skywalker actually comes from, this Mongolian shaman tradition where these people who were called Skywalkers could walk into different worlds. And so that's kind of the focus of the book. And he's talking about how this tradition, carrying this arrow around, one of the things that the shamans would do is that they would give the arrow to someone else that they felt was the embodiment of like the reincarnation of Apollo. And so this apparently is on record in some ancient Greek texts that Abaris Skywalker gave his golden arrow to Pythagoras, seeing that Pythagoras had met these qualifications for being the reincarnation of Apollo. And so one section of this book, though, was really interesting to me, where he's talking about this tradition that bled over into what later became, Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism's practice of, determining who is going to be the next Dalai Lama, like who is the reincarnation. And so I'm just going to read this short passage, and then, I'm going to show in some other things that kind of came to my mind. And then I'm going to go off into some other stuff, but this will all kind of connect together, hopefully. Early Christian fathers were horrified by what is so clearly implied, the existence of a continuous spiritual lineage, even older than theirs. To discredit it, they cooked up as many kinds of contemptuous abuse as they were capable of, used every ounce of virulence and mockery they could muster, and scholars since then have hardly had the will to handle it any better, or start digging it out from under the rubble of misunderstandings that covered it over. But no more is needed than the most fleeting familiarity with Eastern customs to recognize, without any trouble, the routine procedure adopted by Tibetan or Mongol tulkus for proving who they are. So a tulku is like the reincarnation of Apollo, is what this author is saying. by correctly picking out the objects that used to belong to them in their previous incarnations. And so just that little tidbit right there of, you know, how they determine who is this reincarnation. They lay out these objects in front of the candidate, and if the candidate picks the objects that used to belong to them, then they know that this person is the reincarnation that they're looking for. And so immediately I was thinking about the show Lost. And there's a scene in Lost, and you can see here, this John Locke in Lost, when he's a child. This is after he's sort of traveled through time. And so he's visited Richard Alpert back in like the 1950s. He walks into the camp and he seems to know Richard, but Richard hasn't met him yet. So Locke is now time traveling. And so, you know, that's going to kind of tie into what I'm going to talk about after this. But one of the ways that Richard Alpert tests John Locke when he goes to visit John Locke as a child is that he lays out these objects in front of him, and he wants him to pick one specific object, but Locke ends up picking 3 objects that do belong to the older John Locke. Right. And this is before. So this is him as a child picking out objects that will belong to him later, before, you know, this is before he's gone to the island and before he started to time travel. So it made me think of that. And then the other thing that just recently hit my consciousness, people keep talking about this new Marky Mark movie called Infinite. And I have not watched the movie. I sort of get the plot, you know, he's an immortal, right? But let's go here. So this is the trailer for the movie Infinite with Mark Wahlberg. And this is like the scene that they chose to show for the trailer. And I'm not going to play the sound, but just watch what's going on here. You can see here, this guy comes into this room. He's handcuffed to this desk. And he's telling him which of these objects belong to you. Look inside. Right. And then we go back here. And he's putting this sword out on the table. And now he's opening this bag and he's going to put out some more objects. And he's asking him which of these objects belong to you. Of course, Mark Wahlberg doesn't seem to have a clue what he's talking about. And now he's testing him. He's going to pull the trigger on this gun. And so here we have, again, the same type of scene, right? This is taken from this ancient tradition that apparently is still used today when they're deciding who the next Dalai Lama is. And now he's having these flashbacks as he touches the object. And so he realizes that it's his. So that's enough of that. But, you know, just to highlight the fact that, you know, Hollywood likes to put these little things into their movies and their TV shows. And, you know, here's this random book that is talking about the same practice. Now, this was not, you know, something I knew about, but I'm sure other people have known about this in the past. And so, you know, this was what's going through my mind as I'm reading this book and I'm making these connections. And, you know, the book is talking about the reincarnation aspect, but the shamans who had this golden arrow that would enable them to walk in between worlds or walk into the sky or into other dimensions. You know, of course, in the show Lost, you could argue that that's really what they're doing, that, you know, John Locke and the others are in like a different world. They're outside of time. They're in another place where time doesn't operate in the same way. And we see that the island itself can travel through time, and that John Locke himself travels through time and gets separated from some of the others. And this movie here, I haven't watched it, so I can't really say for sure, but I would imagine that it has that element of reincarnation and time travel, right? They kind of go hand in hand, because reincarnation is sort of like time traveling in a sense. And so I just thought that was an interesting thing. And so I'm feeling very unmotivated, but I'm kind of inspired by this book. And I'm sitting around, and I'm sitting on the couch, and just randomly I wonder about the drug angel dust. For whatever reason, I don't know, it just popped into my head. And so I start looking at angel dust, right? And wondering, why did they call it angel dust? Is angel dust the same thing as PCP? And, how did it get its name? And so, I went and I looked it up, and of course, yes, angel dust is PCP. Now, the one thing that I remember about angel dust is all of the horror stories that I heard about, like back in the 90s, in the late 80s, about angel dust causing people to feel like they were invincible, making people think that they could fly, and people jumping off buildings and killing themselves, or doing horrible things to themselves because they couldn't even relate to their own bodies, and they didn't relate to reality whatsoever. And so I'm going to read some of this, but it's very indicative of some things that I've heard from people that have taken DMT or ayahuasca, and going into these different realms of reality. And so, it's this drug that's used for its mind-altering effects. And they're calling these hallucinations, right? Distorted perceptions of sound and violent behavior. As a recreational drug, it is typically smoked, but may be taken by mouth, snorted, or injected. It may also be mixed with cannabis or tobacco. Adverse effects may include seizures, coma, addiction, and an increased risk of suicide. Flashbacks may occur. So essentially, this drug is an anesthetic, and it works primarily as an NMDA receptor antagonist. So it blocks certain things from being recepted by the brain. It's used in the United States, and it peaked in the US in the 1970s. And then, of course, in the early to mid 2000s, I guess there was an uptick in emergency departments reporting people coming in with weird reactions to angel dust. It was made in 1926 and brought to market as an anesthetic medication in the 1950s. So they developed it in 26, and it wasn't until the 50s that it was actually being used as an anesthetic. So whatever was going on with this drug in between that time, there was maybe a 30-year time period where they had plenty of time to test this drug. Its use in humans was disallowed in 1965 due to the high rates of side effects, while its use in animals was disallowed in 78. So, using it on humans only lasted maybe 10, 15 years. And then they discovered the drug ketamine, and they found that ketamine was better tolerated as an anesthetic. So, and there's a number of derivatives of PCP that have been sold for recreational and non-medical use. And so I'm looking at some of these effects, and it says that, the behavioral effects can vary by dosage. Low doses produce a numbness in the extremities and intoxication characterized by staggering, unsteady gait, slurred speech, bloodshot eyes, and loss of balance. Moderate doses will produce analgesia and anesthesia. High doses may lead to convulsions. And so, they make this drug illegally and produce it under poor conditions. And so that's why when people buy it on the street, they don't really know what they're getting. They don't know the dosage that they're taking. And this is why you can have unpredictable results. But this is what was interesting to me. So the psychological effects include severe changes in body image, loss of ego boundaries, paranoia, and depersonalization. Psychosis, agitation, and dysphoria, hallucinations, blurred vision, euphoria, and suicidal impulses are also reported, as well as occasional aggressive behavior. Like many other drugs, PCP has been known to alter mood states in an unpredictable fashion, causing some individuals to become detached and others to become animated. PCP may induce feelings of strength, power, and invulnerability, as well as a numbing effect on the mind. And so this is what I remember most, was that, you would hear these stories of people who were on PCP that had superhuman strength. They could lift up cars. I remember hearing a story about a mother that was on PCP, and there was like a car accident and their child was trapped underneath this car, and the mom was able to lift this car up and pull the child out from underneath the car. And they're, so it's not just people think that they have superhuman strength. They actually display feats of strength that are beyond what a normal human being can possibly do. And so here's this drug that's giving people a glimpse into another reality, or allowing them to see more of this reality than most of us see, on a normal day. Most of us just see a certain band of frequency, a certain, part of reality. But there's more going on all around us that we're not perceiving. And this drug is blocking these receptors, right? And so something is being blocked. It's like the code in the body that's governing how much of reality you can experience and you can perceive, and that's being shut off. And so now you're seeing all of this other reality that you don't normally see, and we're calling it hallucinations. We're saying it's not real, it's all in the mind. But as we're coming to really figure out, is that that's not really the truth. The truth is that we're just seeing more of something that's real, that's there, but we just aren't perceiving it with our normal, everyday, sober mind. And this drug is apparently giving you like superhuman powers as well. And so they go on to talk about how the CIA had looked into it and quickly discarded any inquiries into the drug because they felt like it had no application for warfare, which is interesting given that, it gives people superhuman strength and it's putting them into, another reality. I don't really think the CIA stopped looking into this drug at all. But, maybe they found that ketamine was a much better drug to use for their purposes. And, we'll look at that drug as well, because this is kind of just what started me off on looking into this stuff. And, of course, this drug has been completely demonized. If you search PCP, I mean, the first several search pages are only just like rehab centers and medical journals talking about the horrible side effects and how terrible this drug is. And they even, like, one example that Wikipedia gives is the case of this rapper, Big Lurch, that was convicted of murdering and cannibalizing his roommates while under the influence of PCP, which sounds a lot like what we hear about with bath salts, right? And so, interestingly enough, bath salts are very closely related to PCP. In fact, it's called PVP, right? Or on the street, it's called Flocka. And this is bath salts. And it's actually a different type of drug. It's a synthetic stimulant and not an anesthetic. And this was also developed in the 1960s. And they sell it as this designer drug. And it's very popular in Florida, apparently. And so anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that PVP and PCP have these similar characteristics, like what people report experiencing on Flocka and what they report experiencing on angel dust are similar. Although, with bath salts, we definitely see more of like the psychotic cannibalistic behavior and like running around naked. But there's definitely that feeling of invincibility, the dissociation from reality and self. And so they're saying that, recreational doses of PCP induce a psychotic state that resemble a schizophrenic episode. And so, they're talking to people that aren't there, they're hearing things, auditory things are happening that nobody else can hear. And, I've talked about this before that, this is what, on amphetamines, if you take enough amphetamines and you stay up for days on end, that you begin to experience visual and auditory anomalies that, you might call them hallucinations, but you're really just starting to see more of reality. You're seeing into these other worlds. And so, I thought this was interesting. And they call this angel dust, right? And of course, there's the drug scopolamine, which is used, it comes from Colombia, it comes from this tree, and they blow this powder into your face and you forget everything. You go blank. And, they use it to rob people and do other things to them, right? And then they have no memory of it. And that's actually called devil's dust. So you got angel's dust and devil's dust. And so I'm having this conversation the other day with this woman, and she's mentioning to me that there's a person. I think she said they're using PVP, and that they had figured out that with the right dosage, because it has to be based on a person's body weight. If they take a dosage that's too little for their body weight, nothing will happen. If they take a dosage that's too large, right, they're going to have, reports of like these violent episodes, right? Cannibalizing and eating your roommate. But with the right dose for your weight, that it can actually reverse aging. And one of the receptors that it's blocking seems to have something to do with turning off the body's code, right? Like there's a signal that's being received by these receptors telling the body and the cells within the body where they are within time. And that's what's causing the aging. And that when you block those receptors, the cells begin to go back to their original state. Like outside of time, everything is eternal. Nothing ages, nothing dies. So you see that these cells, when they're not receiving that signal, the cells rejuvenate and you begin to look younger, right? And there's applications for this, for anti-aging and reversing the aging process in the human body. But what it got me thinking about was, what is time? Like how does the body know that it's in time, right? We have these internal clocks, but that is more like a signal that the body is just receiving from somewhere. And if that signal is blocked, then the body is not going to age. Time is going to feel different, right? When people report being on these trips, whether it be angel dust, PCP, or DMT, or mushrooms, even LSD, right? People report feeling like their concept of time has completely changed. You can feel like you have experienced something that lasted days or 10 hours and you were only gone for 20 minutes. So your entire perception of time changes. And what these drugs do is they're blocking whatever signal that keeps you locked into this dimension of time and space. And they're allowing your consciousness to perceive all of reality, right? Outside of time, outside of space. And so you will leave, you feel like you've left your body, but really it's just your consciousness is perceiving more of the world, or whatever is out actually there in this reality. So I thought that was really interesting that these drugs by blocking these receptors, they seem to be messing with our perception of time, and not just our perception of it, but the signal of time itself. And this gets into, time traveling. Like, if you're going to travel in time, you have to be able to leave a time stream and go into another one, right? And so something would have to potentially block these receptors, enabling you to travel. And so that might be an aspect, of traveling to other realities, other dimensions, and other timelines, is the purposeful blocking of some of these receptors. Now, I don't know this. I don't know if this is completely accurate, or, just it's all in my head, but, it definitely led me to some of these thoughts. And so I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be great? Because all you get on here is the horror stories. And I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, here you have this drug, PCP, that seems like it's the worst possible thing you could ever put in your body. All of these reports of, people committing suicide and ripping teeth out of their head and eating their roommates and murdering people. It's like, why would you take this drug? Who in their right mind would want to do this drug? And, obviously it was very popular, and it's addictive as well, but there's got to be something more to it. And so they mentioned that they stopped using this drug because they found ketamine, right? And ketamine became like this more preferable alternative in anesthetic, in like the medical field, for hospitals and for surgery. And so what an anesthetic does is it just lowers your breathing rate and your pulse rate, right? And it takes you down close to death, and you get almost to that point of death, and then you begin to have these experiences. So something's happening, it's blocking some receptors in your brain, and you're able to perceive more of reality than you normally do. And so ketamine seems to be a drug that has the very similar effects to PCP, but without the, terrible, awful, horrible side effects. So I thought, why doesn't somebody just, it would be great if I could just read about what people experience while they're on angel dust or PCP. And so my wife turns to me and she's like, well, somebody wrote about ketamine. They wrote a book about their experiences on ketamine. I'm like, oh, well, what's the book called? Of course, she didn't remember, but my wife's very good. She's like a sleuth when it comes to tracking down a link or finding something. So it took her maybe 20 minutes, and she was able to find the book that she was looking for. And she found it on Amazon, right? Of course, it's $673. But she did say that it was like this rare, hard to find book. And so it's called Journeys into the Bright World. And it's by a woman named Marcia Moore and Howard Altunian, who apparently was an anesthesiologist in Seattle. And so this whole book is really Marcia's account of her ketamine trips that she took over the course of like a year or two. And so her husband, being an anesthesiologist, would help her and inject her with the dosage. And so I thought, okay, this is great. I want to get this book, but I'm not going to pay $673 for it. So luckily, my wife was able to find a PDF copy of the book. And so, I decided to start reading it, and I've read about the first chapter, and it's pretty fascinating, especially given, the story about Marcia Moore and who she was and what happened to her. So we're going to get into that. But first, I wanted to read an excerpt from this book. And so I am going to pull that up here. And so this is her first session that she had while taking ketamine. It was in 1976, Big Sur, California, session 1. So these are like her notes on her experience of taking the drug ketamine at 50 milligrams. And this was injected intravenously. And I just want to preface this by saying that Like, I'm not condoning using any of these drugs at all. And I've not used any of these drugs myself and probably never will. I just find it interesting. The experiences that people are having on these drugs are very similar to experiences that I have had on amphetamines, right? And so I've talked about this before, and I don't believe that they are hallucinations. I believe that they are very real experiences. And I believe that, I was glimpsing just ever so slightly into other realities. And so I'm going to read this little excerpt, and, it's pretty mind blowing. It started with a slight giddiness and a noise like the chirping of crickets. The cricket chorus rapidly swelled to a smooth purring roar, similar to that produced by the motor of a well-tuned racing car. This was not one solid sound, but rather a propeller-like staccato whir, which seemed to come from an external source. I felt effulgently happy and at ease, even though the traceries of dark beams against the white ceiling were now dancing back and forth and dissolving into a kaleidoscopic reverie of geometrical designs. The sensation was reminiscent of the times I had inhaled nitrous oxide at the dentist's office, but that had been like standing at a door. This time, I was going in. I also felt like going home. My voice thickened. Speech was impossible. And then I was spinning around and around like tumbleweed, and the sense of familiarity was becoming greater and greater. In the next half hour, during which the drug was operating at maximum potency, I never lost consciousness, even though ordinary body awareness was totally gone. To an observer, I would have appeared completely insensible, deeply anesthetized. Yet, even though the memory of that state remains, it can only be called indescribable. To speak of a thunderous silence or a multidimensional sphere turning upon itself, or of identification with undifferentiated vibratory energy, is probably as close as words can come to portraying a truly ineffable condition of existence. This inner realm, full of sound, color, and sensation, was itself entirely formless. Here, there could be no distinctions between subject and object, this and that, I and thou. Only the vast, nameless, faceless process remained, churning on and on and on. Somehow it seemed evident that it would continue to roll around that way forever, like a ponderous wheel upon which the chariots of the gods might ride on to eternity. It came to me that this was also a mill wheel by whose grinding action my small personal concerns were being entirely rubbed out. The last husks of I-ness were wrested from my grasp, pulverized and shucked off like chaff reduced to dust. Yet the light of awareness shone on undiminished. That is, the ego was gone, yet the self was exactly as it always had been. For a discipline-prone individual like myself, who had always made a staunch effort to remain on top of every situation, this necessity to relinquish every last vestige of control was an amazing state of affairs. But now there was no choice but to drop all sense of separate identity, all plans, purposes, thoughts, feelings, and desires, and simply urge onward upon this sonorous, revolving circuit of primal power. There was nothing, absolutely nothing that could be done except to submit and let it be. In all this, I did not feel that I was being elevated to a higher level of existence. Rather, the substance of my earthbound psyche was being inexorably reduced to its own common denominator, like molecules and atoms dissolving into some infrangible substratum of electricity. To summarize that instant and insistent transformation, I would say that the lesson this and subsequent ketamine trips taught me was that one can discard all traces of ego awareness and individual volition and still be more than one was before. The loss of personality does not bring extinction. It seems to me, therefore, that any thoughtful person who tries the same experiment and achieves similar results must be disposed to accept the fact of immortality. How else can it be possible to drop the body, emotions, and mind and still exist as a self-aware entity in a realm of infinite and animate potential? How else can one suffer the loss of every known form of sensory perception, pass through that roaring void of hyperkinetic numinosity, and then return intact to the human condition? Even though we sink down through the bottomless abyss, falling all the way to its nethermost depths, there is something in us that endures and rises again into the light of a new day. For years, I had read of such states of being in the writings of Eastern philosophers and Western mystics, but most of what they had said had of necessity remained book knowledge. In general, their word pictures related about as closely to my ketamine experience as the blueprint of a house relates to the daily exigencies of functioning within that structure. We are indeed fortunate that blueprints are provided, and they are indisputably useful. On the other hand, such line drawings can convey only the barest impression of how it actually feels to live, move, and grow up within that home situation. Unquestionably, the most interesting part of this first ketamine trip was the gradual process of spacing back into the body. As it dawned on me that I still possessed a physical form and would have to repossess it, my first thought was, oh dear, I have completely blown my mind. Now my friends will have to deal with a zombie. What a bummer for them. At that point, it didn't seem remotely possible that I could ever return to the phenomenal world of things and doings in which I had formerly functioned. Vaguely, it entered my head that I was on a lecture tour and was supposed to be speaking about something called hypersentience. The word had a somewhat familiar ring, but I couldn't recall what it signified. What was it? So now I'll have to cancel the tour. Will Isabel go on alone? Well, life continues, even if this small self is out of the running. The music in the background was ethereally beautiful. Jane had put on a record of Hindu chants, and I had never heard such superlative sounds. Listening was sheerest ecstasy. Rama, Rama, the voices flowed on, and I was melting into the iridescent current of divine love. Everything is perfect, absolutely perfect, I exclaimed to myself in wonder. How could Jane have known that this music would be so soul satisfying just at this time? As I began to look out of my eyes once more, I became aware that Jane was sitting silently beside me. It seemed so terribly important that she should be there and that we should be sharing this sacred interval together. I fancied that we were fellow priestesses in ancient Egypt, that I had been laying in a stone sarcophagus in a death-like trance, and that she was my hierophant who would usher me back to the world of the living. Images of columned temples, sphinxes, pyramids, and winged figures floated behind her. I loved her enormously and felt that we had been through something like this before in one of the mystery schools of legendary eras. Surely we would remain soul sisters forever. You are my initiator, I whispered, certain that she would understand. For some reason, I also wanted to convey to her that I thought that ketamine was a gift from Venus. Not just that it was a Venusian substance in the astrological sense, but that I felt as though it had actually been brought or manifested from another higher planet as a gift of grace to help relieve the present human plight. But the idea was too complex, and I gave up trying to speak of it. When once again I was able to look at my watch, I realized that the entire experience had lasted less than an hour. My mind felt pure, peaceful, and refreshed, though when I tried to move, I discovered that I was still dizzy. I knew that I would sleep well that night, as indeed I did. The following morning, I felt as though the conduits of my consciousness had been thoroughly cleansed. Stepping outside was like witnessing the dawn of creation. Every leaf and flower was polished to a brilliant sheen. The sea sparkled and the air was dewy fresh. I knew that there would be many impressions to ponder on the way north. Seemingly, some element of my former personality had died, but some other part that was far more vital had been reborn. Whatever it was that wanted to come to life was important, but I didn't yet know how or why. Perhaps it would be enough simply to wait patiently without pushing or prodding to see what might emerge from a new season of growth. And so, I really like connected with that, and it reminded me a lot, of the stuff that I'm reading in this other book, A Story Waiting to Pierce You, about the experiences that these shaman have when they go into these other worlds and they're interacting with, God, or whatever their conception is. Right, our perception of these other realities really colors our experience, I think. Obviously, we're going to find out, I'm going to go more into who Marcia Moore was. Right, she wasn't just some random person that decided to take a bunch of ketamine and write about it. And here again, like the last time we talked about Carlos Castaneda and the women, and everything that Castaneda was talking about, going into these different worlds, right? And so here we have this again, although they're not using exercise in this sense. This is talking about chemicals, but we're still talking about the same thing: people wanting to travel outside of time into different worlds and different realities. And so Marcia Moore is an interesting person, and like I said, she's not just anybody. So Marcia Moore, born May 22nd, 1928, was an American writer, astrologer, and yoga teacher brought to national attention in 1965 through Jess Stream's book, Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. She was an advocate and researcher of the dissociative properties of the drug ketamine, right? But she disappeared in 1979, although her remains were found in 1981, the case and circumstances of her death are still unknown. So here again, we have a person that is experimenting and wanting to go into different worlds, and she's doing it via ketamine. Although, as you'll see, she was very much into esoteric literature, the occult, yoga, tarot, all of these types of things, right? And so this woman, Moore, she was born Marcia Sheldon Moore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the only daughter of Robert L. Moore, founder of the Sheraton hotel chain, and Eleanor Turner Moore, who was an artist, illustrator, and esotericist. So now you've got Robert Moore, who is this hotel tycoon, right? Kind of much like Conrad Hilton. And then you have his daughter, Paris Hilton, right? You see these hoteliers, making all of this monies. And back then, the Sheraton was competing against Hilton and some of these other hotel chains, right? So she came from money. And I would imagine, like, I can't find a whole lot about Robert L. Moore, but I'm sure if I dig more into him, I will definitely find some interesting stuff, because he married this woman who was an artist, illustrator, and esotericist. So, I'm thinking that Robert Moore definitely came from money, and so did his, esotericist wife, Eleanor. And then they had 3 boys: writer Robert Robin Moore, who is probably the most famous for writing the book The Green Berets, which was made into a movie, and The French Connection, which was also made into a movie. And so this guy is also very interesting, although I'm not going to go too much into him in this video. But I mean, you could look into this guy's connections with the military industrial complex. They made him like an honorary special forces guy. And I think he did serve in World War II with the Army, but he was in the Air Corps. And so he was like a gunner, and he survived World War II. And then he does, all of this writing about Green Berets and special forces. And he got into some controversy with a book that he did about, the search for Osama bin Laden. And it turns out that, one of the sources he used was just making shit up. So, he definitely ran in some interesting circles, and we'll hear more from him about his sister. And so we know that, she published this book with her husband. She also published several other books, and she was set to take over the hotel chain from her dad, but that, sort of fell to her brother, Robin. And he also spent some time in Cuba when Castro was in power. And he wrote some things about Castro as well. So definitely a well-connected family, military industrial complex and intelligence connections all over the place. And so this woman chooses to be, a yoga instructor and an esotericist herself. And so in the winter of 1979, so the book that I read from, Journeys into the Bright World, all about her ketamine experiences with her anesthesiologist husband in Seattle, that book came out in 1978. So 1 year after that, in the winter of 1979, at age 50, Moore disappeared. Her remains were found 2 years later in the woods near her Washington home. It has been hypothesized that on a winter night in the forest, Moore had injected all the ketamine available to her, became unconscious, and died of hypothermia. Her lower jaw was identified via dental records. Anne Rule, who was like a true crime person, stated that Moore's skull had been found with a hole in it. One of her friends suspected it was a bullet hole, but investigators believed it probably just happened because the skull was exposed to the elements, right? So you have a hole in a skull, and the cops are saying, nah, it wasn't a bullet hole. It's probably just weather, right? It's only been out there for 2 years. Also, what they don't tell you in this Wikipedia article is that, only part of her skull was found. No other bones were found. They did find like a leg bone or a femur or something, but they couldn't identify it as being her. And it wasn't found with the skull. And it was found several miles from where she lived, like on the side of a highway in some like heavily overgrown brush that was being cleared away for a new development project, right? And so that's the only reason they even found the partial skull, that they were able to get the lower jaw and identify the dental records. So, in the Castaneda case, we had a woman who drove out to the desert and then like half her skeleton is found. And so they thought, well, she just killed herself out in the desert and like, I don't know, animals took the rest of her bones away. I mean, maybe it's plausible. Right. But, the fact that they wouldn't even look into the bullet hole in the skull is odd to me. And they think, so if you read this book in the introduction, she painstakingly goes over like her methodical approach to using ketamine in a scientific way, right? And so she definitely approaches it from a scientific standpoint, but she's an explorer. She's trying to break ground. Not that she was the first to do this, right? John Lilly, who she credits in her book, apparently told her to stop using ketamine so much, but he had definitely done work with ketamine before her. But she was really trying to capitalize on the psychedelics movement and the spiritual movement that was going on during the 60s and late 70s. And she wanted to experiment, but she did it in a very controlled setting. And her husband was a anesthesiologist. So you get the sense from the introduction that she wouldn't just recklessly shoot up all of the ketamine that she had available, walk out into the middle of into the woods on the side of the highway and just sit down under a tree, right? And shoot it all up and then die of hypothermia, right? It sounds absolutely ridiculous. There's no way that that's what happened. So, I mean, even like just the main theory on how this woman died says that, it doesn't make sense. Again, it's like the dumbest story ever. And so she's been married like 4 times. And this was her 4th husband that she was on. She first marries this guy called Simmons Roof, and she had 3 children with him, Louisa, Christopher, and Jonathan. The couple divorced and she remarried Lewis Acker. And then she married Mark Douglas and moved to Maine. And they published some books on yoga. In the late 70s, she married Howard Altunian and they moved to Washington. So she's like going from Maine to Seattle. So she's just like bi-coastal, grew up in Massachusetts. she was privileged. She had money. She could afford to just do whatever she wanted. I mean, it even talks about her early education. You know, she went to Radcliffe. She studied astrology. I mean, you know, she just had a life of leisure to, you know, look into the kind of things that she was looking into. So that, like, the story of her disappearance just doesn't add up. Like, a year after writing and publishing this book, she vanishes. And so, you know, well, what about the husband? Like, what was he doing? Right. So then I find this article. This was from March 26th, 1981. So she disappears winter of 79. So this was shortly after they find her partial skull. And her brother, Robin, the author of The Green Berets and The French Connection, he was interviewed, right? And so writer Robin Moore, the best-selling author of The French Connection, The Green Berets, says his sister's mysterious death may be the work of witches or a cult that ceremoniously beheads animals. The bizarre suggestion was made a day after authorities positively identified a skull found in a swampy area of North Seattle as that of his sister, Marcia Moore, who had been missing 2 years. I don't for 1 minute believe that my sister died a natural death, Moore said Wednesday from his home in Westport, Connecticut. I think her demise was assisted perhaps by a cult we don't even know about. Marcia was targeted by these people on several occasions. Ms. Moore, heiress to the Boston blue blood fortune of Sheraton hotel chain founder Robert Moore, was a nationally known author on psychic phenomena who experimented with the hallucinogenic drug ketamine, an anesthetic, in the months prior to her disappearance. Her anesthesiologist husband, Howard Altunian, reported her missing after coming home from a movie around midnight on January 14th, 1979, and finding no trace of her at their duplex in the Alderwood Manor section of Seattle. So again, like, this doesn't make sense either. What, this guy is just like, hey, honey, you want to go to a movie? No, I'm just going to shoot some ketamine. All right, cool. Well, I'll just see you later. I'm going to go catch the late show. And then he comes home and she's just decided, you know what, I'm not going to do ketamine at home in like a comfortable, familiar, like peaceful, controlled setting. I'm going to go out, you know, because it's cold. It's like January in Seattle. So I'm going to go outside and shoot ketamine like in the woods next to a highway somewhere. And that makes total sense, right? So like none of this makes sense. Like he would have been there if she was going to shoot ketamine, right? And this was part of her experimentation. Furthering her work that she'd done for the book, I would imagine that he would be there with her, administering and working the tape recorder for her notes, right? But he decides to go to a movie. Well, why didn't she go with him, right? I mean, how did they know that she was on ketamine at the time that she disappeared? We don't have any story. Like the police didn't question this guy. So none of this story adds up. So her brother announced his candidacy for U.S. Senate in Connecticut on Wednesday, said his 51-year-old sister told him in 1977 that a witch's coven was trying to kill her. So the plot thickens here. The author said the matter came up while he was traveling in Rhodesia in 1977. So Rhodesia was actually founded by Cecil Rhodes, who was the founder of the Round Table Group. If anyone is, you know, familiar with that group and those individuals back in the early 1900s, Cecil Rhodes was heavily influential in, you know, things like Tavistock. So, you know, Rhodesia is now, I believe, Zimbabwe. So, you know, he just happens to be in Rhodesia, I guess, traveling for one of his novels that he's doing research on. And so while he's in Rhodesia, he receives a letter from a doctor offering his condolences about the death of his sister. Moore, 55, said he immediately called Marcia, who told him that an occult group was trying to rattle her by sending the letter to him. He said she provided no details of the plot. So, I mean, how does this occult group get his mailing address in Rhodesia? right? Like, this doesn't seem like just some random witches coven. They obviously knew where this guy was. I mean, if he's telling the truth, of course, because like his story seems a little bit absurd as well, right? Oh, it's a witches cult. They sent me a letter while you were in Africa. How would they know where to send the letter while you're in? How do they know you're in Africa, right? Like, it. None of these things add up in this story at all. The fact that her head was totally separated might possibly indicate that the head was severed, he said. I don't know, but I do know that there are cults in which they behead animals as part of their ceremony. So, like, again, he's really stretching here. He said he asked the Snohomish County, Washington coroner if the head had been neatly severed from the body, but that he was told it was impossible to tell because only the upper portion of the skull was found. So they didn't even find the full skull. And apparently that portion had a hole in it. And then they had like the lower jaw and the upper portion of the skull. So where's the rest of the body, right? I mean, if you just wandered out, one article said she climbed a tree and shot the ketamine and died in the tree. And like, where are the bones, right? Moore, who has penned several less well-known books about witches and the occult, said the information would have helped him confirm or disprove his theory that Marcia's body was hacked to pieces and dumped in various locations to prevent a search plane equipped with infrared devices from spotting her remains. He said an air search of that type was conducted 3 weeks after she vanished. So, they're looking for, apparently they have infrared devices back in, 1979 on, police aircraft that can search for missing people, especially if, you're the daughter of a wealthy hotel tycoon. The skull was found Friday by a person clearing land just off a highway in Bothell, Washington, for a construction project. Sheriff's deputies said other bones, including a leg bone, were discovered, but they have not been positively identified as being part of the woman. So again, like, is this just a dumping ground for a serial killer that's just dumping bones of people or, body parts? He just throws them out of a car at night and they go into this brushy area. Who knows? Miss Moore's wealth allowed her to indulge herself. She attended Radcliffe, took courses in meditation, traveled to India to study yoga, and eventually wrote or co-authored 7 books. Among the writings were books on astrology, time regression, and reincarnation, right? These are the things that we have been talking about, like in the, the Mark Wahlberg movie, in the show Lost, this whole idea of being reincarnated, being an immortal, right? And like this little test that's set up to test these people. And, as she's talking about her experiences on ketamine, I kept thinking about, all of those things. I kept thinking about how all of these things are like tying in together. There's so many similarities here. Right. So time regression, reincarnation, and Moore said that because of the parameters of her interests, she was constantly being threatened by occult groups and witches' covens. Like that again, to me, doesn't make any sense. Why would a coven of witches be concerned with a wealthy hotel heiress who writes books on yoga, reincarnation, and time regression? Why would they be threatening her life? None of that makes sense. Honestly, I don't, unless she was writing something that was negative or untrue about, these witches or their practices. Why would they have any interest in like harming this woman? I don't even see that, like their interests are that far out of alignment with each other. Like, I think they would probably get along, but, we're going to find out here. So the article continues. Dr. Altunian, 43. So he was like much younger than her, probably by like 7 years younger. He lives in a farmhouse in South Bend, a small Southeast Washington community. He could not be reached for comment. He shortly moved like across the country after this happened too, as well. And so I guess that's the end of this article. Yeah. So, the whole thing, just none of it really added up, but it's interesting, right? We got another woman who is kind of into traveling into other worlds, reincarnation, you know, a lot of the stuff we saw in the Castaneda saga. And then she goes missing. And then 2 years later, part of her skeleton, like not even just part of her skull is found. And I think there was a book that was written by a married couple about her death and disappearance. I haven't read it. I think it's called Disintegration, like the story of her death. You know, they claim to sort of put the story to rest, but you know, honestly, I don't think we're ever really going to know what happened. Just like we are never really going to know what happened to the woman that they found out in the desert that supposedly just killed herself because like none of these stories make any real sense. And all you have to do is just apply some basic logic, you know, and read the stuff they're saying. It's like, this is something like a child wouldn't even accept this explanation, right? It doesn't make sense. And, you know, something else I found that was interesting as I was looking into Marcia Moore, right, is that there are other Marcia Moores. There's a Marcia Moore who apparently does these sculptures of skulls, right, that have elongated skulls. So, you know, she does a lot of work around trying to reimagine what the people would look like that had these elongated skulls that have been found. So that was interesting, right? And they also found this Marcia Moore, who was an actress, born 1891 to 1920, so very young, died young, was an American actress known for her roles as Dorothy in the earliest film adaptations of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. She is the first actress to portray the character of Dorothy Gale on screen, 29 years before Judy Garland's portrayal of Dorothy in the 1939 Wizard of Oz. So again, Marcia Moore playing Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, and you know, all with the Wizard of Oz programming and all of that. You know, she did several of these: Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and the Scarecrow in Oz, The Land of Oz. And then she went on to do some other movies. I can't really find anything about her, you know, how she even died. There's very little about her. I can't even find like a photograph of her. But anyway, so, you know, I just wanted to throw this video together to do something. I know I've been kind of gone for a week or two, and, you know, I'm going to get back more into it again. I know that these things go in cycles. Like I feel like motivation comes, and, you know, at some point I go through this cycle of like having no motivation whatsoever. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, you know, and I found it very fascinating. I'm going to continue to read both of these books because I think, you know, her experiences that she had on ketamine, you know, are very telling about, you know, other worlds. I don't know too many books. Like I know Leary and some other people have talked and written about their experiences, but this woman approached it from such a, you know, scientific research perspective. And yet, right, she's very tapped into, you know, esoteric literature and the occult. And so she's very knowledgeable about those things as well. And, you know, one person said in an article that really, you know, colored her experience. And I'm sure it did. Just as the shamans of Mongolia, right, their view on reality and where they came from and who they were, you know, that's going to shape their experiences with this other reality or these other worlds and time itself, right? And I don't think that any of them are wrong per se. I don't think that there's one right answer. I think that there are so many different possibilities. Like it just depends on the individual, really, and the culture and the time in which you're raised, right? It's going to affect how you perceive these experiences until, of course, you know, you get to a stage where you're beyond just having an experience and coming back into your body, and you're actually like going into different worlds and leaving this place and, you know, becoming a Skywalker. possibly. I don't know. So anyway, until next time, we'll see you.